Maria had always heard stories from her grandmother, mother, and aunts about what they referred to as the weight of our lineage. In her parents' house, a recurring conversation was about the challenges and tragedies that had occurred in different generations of the family. Each woman spoke of how relationships failed, dreams were shattered, and how at some point in their lives, it felt like a fate was trapping them. These stories were always passed down with a sense of bittersweet wisdom, each woman wearing the scars of her experiences as a badge of honor. As a child, Maria had listened to these tales with curiosity, not fully understanding the depth of the impact they would have on her own life. It wasn't until her teenage years that Maria began to feel the weight of these inherited stories pressing on her own life. She noticed that patterns seemed to emerge in her own behavior and relationships. Constant arguments with her parents, making wrong choices in relationships, and an overwhelming sense of being stuck in a cycle she couldn't break. Everything seemed eerily familiar. The more she reflected on her life, the more she realized that these events were not isolated incidents, but echoes of a much larger pattern. At the age of 22, Maria met Lucas. Their connection was immediate, and for a brief moment, everything seemed perfect. But as time passed, the same issues that plagued her past relationships began to resurface. Arguments grew more intense, and Lucas started pulling away. Maria was baffled and frustrated. It felt as though she was living out the same script she had seen play out in her family's history. She tried to break free from the patterns, to rewrite her own story, but no matter how hard she tried, it felt as though something invisible was sabotaging her efforts. Desperate to understand why this kept happening, Maria finally turned to her mother, asking about the family stories she had grown up with. With tears in her eyes, her mother revealed a long-hidden family secret. Her grandmother, despite being a strong woman, had always struggled in her relationships. Maria was raised in a house full of women. Her grandmother, mother, and aunts had a long history of stories they would share with her whenever the family gathered together. These stories, while always fascinating, were not just tales of the past. They carried lessons and warnings. Each of the women in her family spoke about the struggles they had endured, particularly when it came to relationships. They talked about love, loss, pain, and the overwhelming feeling of being trapped in cycles that they couldn't escape. These stories were often accompanied by words of wisdom, but Maria began to notice a pattern that seemed to emerge in every story. No matter how much each woman tried to break free, it always felt like the same things kept happening. As a young girl, Maria would listen attentively to these tales, though they didn't make much sense to her at the time. She understood them as merely stories, lessons on how to be strong, to endure, and to persevere. She thought they were simply reflections of each woman's personal struggles. But as she entered her teenage years, things began to take a different turn. The more she thought about her family's history, the more she realized that what seemed like random events in the lives of these women were actually part of a much larger pattern. A pattern that was slowly beginning to reveal itself in her own life. Maria couldn't escape the feeling that she was destined to follow the same path. The constant arguments with her parents, the turbulent friendships, and the failed romantic relationships, all of it felt eerily familiar. It was as if the same forces that shaped her family's fate were also shaping her own. She couldn't understand why she kept making the same mistakes, why she kept getting stuck in the same emotional patterns. What was it that made her feel as though she were living in a script she didn't even write? One day during a heated argument with her mother, Maria asked a question that had been burning inside her for years. Why do we always end up like this? Why does everything always go wrong, no matter how hard we try? Her mother, who had heard this question countless times before, paused and looked at Maria with sadness in her eyes. At 22, Maria met Lucas. Their connection was instant, a whirlwind of emotions that left her feeling as though she had found someone who could finally break the cycle. The beginning of their relationship was filled with excitement, hope, and the promise of a future that was different from the past. It was everything she had dreamed of, a love that would change everything. But as the months passed, something shifted. The same issues that had haunted her family's relationships began to surface. Arguments started to become more frequent, and what had initially been a blossoming relationship began to feel more like a battlefield. Lucas, once so attentive and present, began pulling away. His detachment confused and hurt Maria. Why was this happening again? Why was she falling into the same patterns she had seen so many times before? She tried everything she could to fix it, but no matter how hard she tried, the relationship seemed to unravel in the same way her mothers and grandmothers had. Maria could feel the familiar weight of those old patterns creeping back into her life. It was as if she was caught in a loop she couldn't escape. She didn't want to be like her mother, stuck in a series of failed relationships. She didn't want to be like her grandmother, constantly fighting to hold on to something that always seemed to slip through her fingers. She desperately wanted to break free, to create a different reality for herself, but something always felt out of her control, as though there were forces beyond her comprehension at work. One evening, after another heated argument with Lucas, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen this before. She realized that this wasn't just a series of bad decisions, it was a pattern. The same emotional responses, the same unresolved tensions, and the same destructive behaviors were playing out in her own life, just as they had in the lives of the women in her family. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just dealing with personal issues. She was dealing with something much deeper, a generational curse. With tears welling up in her eyes, Maria's mother began to speak in a low, almost tremulous voice. "I've always hoped you wouldn't have to experience this, Maria, but I think it's time you understood the truth," she said. The weight of her words settled heavily in the room, and Maria could feel a lump rise in her throat as she braced herself for what was to come. Her mother explained that her grandmother, despite being a woman of incredible strength, had always struggled with relationships. No matter how many times she tried to build a lasting, healthy bond, her relationships would fall apart. Her grandmother's failures in love were not due to a lack of effort, but rather something deeper, a pattern that seemed to plague the women in their family. Her mother, too, had faced similar challenges in her own relationships, trying to break free from the mistakes of the past, but always falling short. Maria's mother had worked hard to change, to find happiness, but in the end, she was always faced with the same sense of disappointment. Maria sat in stunned silence, trying to process her mother's words. She had never known the full extent of her family's struggles. Her mother had always put on a brave face, never showing Maria the pain she had endured. But now the truth was coming to light, and Maria could see the deep scars in her mother's eyes. She could feel the weight of the curse that had been silently passed down from one generation to the next, like an invisible thread connecting them all. It was a cycle of pain, failure, and unfulfilled dreams that seemed impossible to escape. Maria realized that what she had been experiencing was not just bad luck or poor decision-making. It was part of something much larger, something that had been passed down to her through the generations. She had been unknowingly following in the footsteps of the women before her, repeating their mistakes and reliving their pain. But what her mother revealed to her next would change everything. Maria was now facing a truth she had never fully considered before. The struggles she had faced in her life were not just a result of bad luck or poor choices, but part of a much deeper and more complex pattern. Her family's history was filled with stories of women who had tried to break free from destructive cycles, only to find themselves trapped in the same patterns again and again. These patterns weren't merely a series of unfortunate events, they were reflections of deeply ingrained beliefs and behaviors passed down from one generation to the next. As Maria delved deeper into understanding the nature of generational curses, she began to realize how much of her life had been shaped by beliefs that were not her own. These beliefs had been subtly passed down to her through the stories, attitudes, and behaviors of the women in her family. Her grandmother, her mother, and her aunts had all experienced similar struggles in their relationships, and without even realizing it, they had transmitted their fears, doubts, and limiting beliefs onto Maria. The more Maria thought about it, the more she saw the truth in her therapist's words. Generational curses often arise from deeply rooted beliefs that are passed down through family stories, attitudes, and expectations. These beliefs shape how individuals see themselves in the world around them. In many cases, these beliefs are subconscious, so individuals are unaware of the powerful impact they have on their decisions, actions, and outcomes. The beliefs in Maria's family were not just about relationships. They had seeped into every area of life, affecting how each woman viewed herself, her worth, and her place in the world. Maria began to understand that her struggles were not just random occurrences. They were part of a deeply ingrained pattern that had been passed down for generations. But this realization also gave her hope. If these patterns could be passed down through generations, then surely with the right understanding and effort, they could be broken. After coming to the painful realization that she was caught in a generational cycle, Maria knew that breaking free from this pattern would not be an easy task. She understood that it wasn't just about changing a few behaviors or making some temporary adjustments. It was about transforming her entire way of thinking, her mindset, and her belief system. She also understood that she couldn't do this alone. Despite her growing awareness of the generational curse that had shaped her life, Maria knew she needed professional help to guide her through the process of healing and transformation. Determined to find a solution, Maria sought the help of a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and breaking generational patterns. She had heard about how therapy could help individuals uncover deeply buried beliefs and emotional wounds, and she hoped it could provide the tools she needed to break free. At first, Maria felt unsure about therapy. She had heard about it from others, but it seemed like such a daunting step to take. What if she couldn't handle the truth? What if she wasn't able to change? Despite her doubts, Maria took the leap, realizing that it was the only way forward if she truly wanted to break the cycle. Her first session with the therapist was emotional. Maria poured her heart out, speaking about the struggles she had faced in her relationships and the overwhelming sense of being trapped. The therapist listened carefully and then explained something that would change the course of Maria's healing journey. Generational curses are not just about repeating the mistakes of the past. They are about the limiting beliefs that are passed down through families. These beliefs, whether about love, self-worth, or relationships, become ingrained in the family's culture, and unless actively confronted and changed, they continue to shape each new generation. The therapist also explained that breaking these generational curses required more than just awareness. It required a complete reprogramming of the mind. As Maria continued her work with the therapist, she began to understand that the power to break the generational curse wasn't just about removing negative beliefs, it was about rewriting her story entirely. Up until this point, Maria had lived her life according to the script that had been handed down to her by her family. She had unknowingly played the role that had been assigned to her, trapped in the same patterns of pain and disappointment. But now, with each new realization and breakthrough, she began to see that she could choose a different path. She didn't have to follow the same script. She could write her own story. At first, the idea of rewriting her story felt daunting. She had been so accustomed to the idea that her family's history defined her that it was hard to imagine a future where she wasn't bound by the past. But as she worked through her therapy, she realized that breaking free from her family's narrative was a powerful act of self-liberation. Maria was no longer bound by the mistakes and limitations of those who came before her. She had the ability to choose her own direction, to decide what her life would look like moving forward. This process of rewriting her story involved letting go of the old beliefs that had shaped her identity. Maria had always seen herself as someone who would inevitably struggle in relationships, just as her mother and grandmother had. But as she began to challenge that belief, she realized that she was capable of so much more. She could choose to build healthy, loving relationships, to embrace her worth, and to create a life that was based on her own values and desires, not those that had been imposed upon her by her family's past. One of the most powerful changes Maria experienced was in her approach to love and relationships. She had always felt that love was something fleeting, something that could slip away at any moment. But as she rewrote her story, she began to view love as something stable and nourishing, something that she could attract into her life because she was worthy of it. She learned that love wasn't something that could be destroyed by the mistakes of the past. It was something that could be built anew. As Maria continued to transform her life, one of the most crucial steps in breaking the generational curse was learning to make peace with her past. Up until this point, Maria had carried a deep-seated anger and resentment toward her family's history. She had felt betrayed by the women before her who had passed down the patterns of pain and dysfunction. For years, she had blamed her family for the struggles she faced, feeling as though she was destined to carry their burdens forever. But as she worked through her therapy and began rewriting her story, Maria realized that the first step toward true freedom was forgiveness. Forgiveness wasn't easy. Maria had spent so much of her life feeling angry at her family, at her ancestors, and even at herself for repeating the same mistakes. The idea of forgiving felt like an impossible task. How could she forgive her grandmother for the emotional wounds she had inflicted? How could she forgive her mother for passing on the same painful patterns? And most importantly, how could she forgive herself for falling into the same traps? But as she worked through these questions, Maria came to a powerful realization. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the pain or pretending that everything was okay. It was about freeing herself from the emotional chains that had bound her to the past. It was about releasing the anger and resentment that had kept her trapped in the cycle of the curse. Forgiveness was the key to moving forward, to creating a future that wasn't determined by the mistakes and failures of her family's past. Maria also realized that forgiveness was not just for her family. It was for herself. She had to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made, for the times she had felt weak or powerless, for the moments when she had let the patterns of her family control her. Maria's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. What had once seemed like an insurmountable burden, a generational curse that had shaped her family's destiny for as long as she could remember, was now a thing of the past. She had taken control of her own fate, breaking free from the destructive patterns that had plagued her for so long. But Maria understood that this change was not just about her. It was about something much larger. By breaking the curse, she had created a new legacy for her family, one that would impact future generations in ways she couldn't fully comprehend yet. As Maria reflected on her journey, she realized that the most powerful aspect of her transformation was the way she had reclaimed her power. No longer bound by the limiting beliefs and painful patterns of her ancestors, Maria had rewritten her story, choosing a path of healing, growth, and empowerment. Her relationships had improved, her self-esteem had blossomed, and she felt more at peace with herself than ever before. But what mattered most to Maria was that, by breaking the curse, she had changed the course of her family's history. Maria now saw herself as the starting point of a new lineage, a lineage that would be free from the destructive cycles of the past. She had broken the chains that had bound her family for generations, and in doing so, she had created a new foundation upon which future generations could build. Her children, her grandchildren, and beyond would not be cursed with the same struggles and limitations. They would be free to live their lives with the knowledge that they were not bound by the mistakes of their ancestors. This realization gave Maria a deep sense of pride and purpose. She had not just healed herself, she had healed her family's future. By choosing to break free from the generational curse, Maria had created a ripple effect that would continue for generations to come. She knew that this was her true legacy, not just the life she had built for herself, but the freedom she had created for the generations that would follow. Generational curses can feel like an invisible force, shaping our destiny in ways we cannot fully understand. They are often subtle, passed down through the stories we hear, the beliefs we inherit, and the patterns of behavior we unknowingly adopt. These curses can manifest in many ways, affecting our relationships, our self-worth, and our ability to create the life we truly desire. At times, it can feel as though we are trapped, doomed to repeat the mistakes of those who came before us, but the truth is, we have the power to break free from these chains. The first step in breaking a generational curse is recognizing it. We must look at our family history with a discerning eye and understand the patterns that have shaped our lives. It is not always easy to confront the truth about our past, but doing so is essential for our healing. We must acknowledge the ways in which the beliefs and behaviors of our ancestors have influenced our choices, and we must take responsibility for the impact these patterns have had on our lives. Only then can we begin the process of change. Once we understand the curse, the next step is to seek help. No one can break free from a generational curse alone. It takes support, guidance, and the right tools to heal and transform. Therapy, coaching, or spiritual guidance can provide the necessary framework for breaking old patterns and reprogramming our minds. We must be willing to do the work, to challenge our old beliefs, and to rewrite our stories. This is not a quick or easy process, but it is a necessary one if we want to create a new future for ourselves and for the generations that will follow. Forgiveness is another crucial step in breaking the curse. It is not always easy to forgive those who have hurt us, or to forgive ourselves for the mistakes we've made. But forgiveness is a powerful tool for healing. It allows us to release the anger, resentment, and guilt that keep us tied to the past. It is through forgiveness that we can create emotional space for new beginnings. When we forgive, we stop being victims of our family's past and take back control of our own lives.